Somewhere in the mountains of western Virginia, there is a place that no longer appears on any commercial map printed after 1940. It had a name, it had streets, it had a post office, a school, and a church with a white steeple that could be seen from the ridge above on clear mornings. It had families, hundreds of them, who had lived there for generations, farming the same soil their grandparents had cleared by hand more than a century before. And then in the spring of 1938, the United States government told every single one of them to leave. They were given 60 days. Some refused. Some wept openly in the roads. Some signed the papers in silence, not because they agreed, but because they had no other choice left. And by the autumn of that year, the town was gone. Not burned, not bombed, not abandoned naturally the way towns sometimes die. It was erased, fenced off. The roads leading in were blocked. The name was removed from federal survey maps. And the official explanation offered to the public was so simple, so clean, so reasonable, that almost nobody stopped to ask the questions hiding inside it. This is the story of what happened in the Shenandoah Valley, a story buried in federal archives for decades, a story that most Americans have never heard. And the longer you look at it, the stranger it becomes. To understand what happened in 1938, you have to understand the landscape first. The Shenandoah Valley sits between two ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains in what is now Shenandoah National Park in northwestern Virginia. It is beautiful in the way that old things are beautiful, worn smooth by time. Lit gold in October, holding its stories quietly inside the soil. By the early 20th century, this valley was home to over 400 families. Farmers mostly. Some held deeds going back to the 1780s, land granted by the Commonwealth of Virginia. Before the federal government even existed in its current form, they grew apples and corn. They raised cattle. They traded at small market towns along the valley floor. They attended one of 7 churches. Their children walked to one of 3 one-room schoolhouses. They were, by every available measure, exactly the kind of American rural community that politicians routinely described in speeches as the backbone of the nation. In 1920, the U.S. Census recorded 958 individual residents living within what would later become the park boundary. The average family had worked the same land for 3 to 4 generations. Some families had been there longer. The Nicholsons, the Corbin family of Nicholson Hollow, the family of George Pollock, whose resort at Skyland sat on the ridge above and who would, in fact, become one of the loudest advocates for the park, a detail worth noting and worth returning to later. These were not transient people. These were not squatters. These were landowners with legal deeds, many of whom had paid property taxes to the Commonwealth of Virginia for generations. And in 1926, the Virginia state legislature passed a bill authorizing the creation of a national park in the Blue Ridge region. At first, it sounded like good news. Parks meant tourism. Tourism meant money, progress, a sign that Virginia was valued at the federal level. What very few of the valley residents understood, at first, was what a national park actually required. It required the land, all of it. In 1928, federal surveyors arrived in the valley. They carried clipboards and measuring equipment. They walked through fields and knocked on doors. They were polite, professional, unhurried. They did not present themselves as a threat. They introduced themselves as representatives of the federal government, conducting a routine survey of the region. They were also counting. By the time the survey was complete, the federal government had cataloged 465 separate families living within the proposed park boundaries. That number represented approximately 2,000 individual human beings. Their homes, their barns, their root cellars, their cemeteries, where some of their grandparents had been buried since before the Civil War. The official record from the National Park Service, dated September 1929, described the inhabitants as, quote, largely of the mountaineer type, resistant to change. That phrase, resistant to change, would appear again and again in internal federal memorandums over the next decade. It was clinical, neutral on the surface. It carried no obvious malice in the language. But read carefully and you begin to notice something. The people of the Shenandoah Valley were not described in these documents as citizens. They were not described as property owners, with legal rights and generational claims to the land. They were described as a feature of the landscape to be managed, an obstacle in the same category as the terrain itself. And in 1930, Congress formally authorized the creation of Shenandoah National Park. The boundary lines were drawn. The acreage was set at approximately 200,000 acres. And somewhere inside those lines, On paper, in a federal office in Washington, D.C., 465 families ceased to be property owners. They just did not know it yet. The mechanism the government used is important to understand. Because it was not new. It had been used before. It would be used again. The process was called condemnation. Under the legal doctrine of eminent domain, the government's power to seize private property for public use, the Commonwealth of Virginia began the process of condemning land within the park boundary as early as 1931. This meant that even if a landowner refused to sell, even if they had held their deed for 150 years, the state could take the property. The owner would receive what the government determined to be fair market value. They had no legal right to refuse the transaction itself, only to contest the price. But here is where the documented history begins to take on a different texture. The appraisals of property within the park boundary were conducted by state-appointed assessors, not independent valuators, not federal arbitrators, state employees working within a system that had a clear institutional interest in keeping acquisition costs low. Records from the Virginia State Commission on Conservation and Development, which oversaw the land acquisition process, show that the average payment per acre within the Blue Ridge acquisition zone was between $3 and $8, in some cases as low as $1.50 per acre. For context, agricultural land in the broader Shenandoah Valley region, just outside the park boundary, was trading at between $15 and $40 per acre in the same period. The families inside the boundary received, in many documented cases, less than a quarter of what their land would have been worth on the open market. Some were told they could stay, temporarily, that they would be granted lifetime use rights, allowing them to remain on their land until they died. These were called special use permits, and they were extended to the elderly primarily, to those the government calculated would not live long. Enough to create a prolonged administrative problem. It was efficient. It was entirely legal, and it left a very particular kind of scar on the people it touched. By 1934, the removals had begun in earnest. The federal government, working through the newly created Resettlement Administration, a New Deal agency established under President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1935, had constructed what it called homestead communities to absorb the displaced families. The largest of these, built specifically for Shenandoah evacuees, was a settlement in Madison County, Virginia, eventually known as Ida Valley. Later, a second site was prepared in nearby Luray. Each family that accepted relocation received a small house on a small parcel of land. The houses were built to a standard government template. They were modest but structurally sound. The government described the program in its official literature as a humanitarian resettlement effort, providing displaced mountain families with improved housing, access to health care, and a pathway into modern American economic life. The language was genuinely well-meaning in places, but the gap between the official description and the lived experience of the families themselves is documented in remarkable detail, because some of them wrote it down. A Munovatender letter preserved in the archives of the Virginia State Library, written by a farmer named Fenton Heiser, who had been removed from his family's land near Nicholson Hollow, reads in part, "I have no complaint against the house. The house is fine, but this is not my land, and it will never be my land. My grandfather's grave is 3 miles inside that fence, and I cannot go to it without asking permission from a government. Man who was not born when my grandfather died. 3 miles inside that fence." That phrase sat in an archive folder for decades. It is the kind of sentence that tells you something the official records will not say directly. That what had been removed was not just property. What had been removed was continuity. The relationship between a family and a piece of ground across generations. Something that does not appear in an appraiser's calculation of fair market value. Now, here is where the story becomes something more than a local Virginia tragedy. Because Shenandoah was not the only one. Between 1920 and 1945, the United States federal government created or expanded 14 major national parks and forests in the eastern half of the country. In at least 11 of those 14 cases, 11 out of 14, the creation of the park involved the forced or pressured removal of existing rural residents. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, established in 1934, across the Tennessee North Carolina border. Approximately 5,000 residents displaced, many of them Cherokee, descendants and Scots-Irish Appalachian, families with deeds predating the state of Tennessee. Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky, established in 1941, over 600 families removed from land in Edmonson County through condemnation proceedings. Some graves were relocated, some were not. Olympic National Park in Washington State, established in 1938, the same year as the final Shenandoah evacuations, included the removal of several homestead families from the Hoh River Valley. 1938 appears on that list more than once. It is the year the last residents were formally expelled from the Shenandoah boundary. It is the year the Olympic Park legislation was signed. It is the year a significant expansion of Appalachian Trail corridor land acquisition began. Is that a conspiracy? No. These were separate agencies, separate legislation, separate processes, but they were operating within a shared framework, a shared philosophy about what land was for, about who had a legitimate claim to it, about what constituted the proper relationship between the American citizen and the American landscape, and that philosophy had a name, though it was rarely spoken aloud in public. It was called the unencumbered wilderness ideal, the belief, powerful within the conservation movement of the early 20th century, that truly protected natural land must be land from which human settlement has been removed, that the presence of permanent residence was, by definition, incompatible with the concept of wilderness. It sounds almost self-evidently reasonable when you say it that way, and yet, the land inside the Shenandoah boundary had been settled continuously for over 150 years before the park boundary was drawn. The forests that tourists would come to admire as primeval wilderness had in fact been shaped, over generations, by the farming and logging and burning practices of the families who were now being removed to create the illusion of untouched nature. The wilderness they were protecting had people in it. The wilderness they created did not. Those are two different things, and the distinction matters. In 2001, a historian named Katrina Powell published a study of letters written by Shenandoah evacuees, drawn from the Virginia State Library archives and from family collections. She had spent years collecting them. What she found, reading those letters carefully, was a pattern of language that the official government documents almost never used. The letters used the word wrong repeatedly, not in a legal sense, not as a constitutional argument, simply as a statement of something felt to be true, that what was done to them was wrong. The letters used the word home, not as a synonym for house. A house is a structure with a valuation. Home is something else. It is the place where you know the name of every field, where you know which well runs dry in August and which does not, where the dead are buried and where the living remember who the dead were. One letter, written in 1937 by a woman named Mamie Lawson to the Virginia State Conservation Commission, said simply, "You can put a price on my house. You cannot put a price on my mother's garden." The letter received a formal acknowledgement 3 weeks later. The acknowledgement noted that all compensation had been calculated in accordance with state law. There is no record of any further correspondence. By 1938, the year we have been told in every official account, was the final year of the resettlement program. The last families had been removed. The park was officially declared open to the public. The Skyline Drive, running along the mountain ridge above the former homesteads, became one of the most popular scenic routes in the eastern United States. And the town was gone. The streets were gone. The post office was gone. The school was gone. The church with the white steeple was dismantled, board by board, and the wood was either burned or sold. Some of the stone walls are still there if you walk deep enough into the forest. You can find them on certain trails, hidden under decades of fallen leaves, old foundations, the ghost shapes of homes. The National Park Service, to its credit, has in recent years placed interpretive signs at some of these locations. Small brown markers explaining that families once lived here and were asked to leave. Asked is the word they use. Here is what the official history gives us. The creation of Shenandoah National Park was a legitimate exercise of federal authority under the doctrine of eminent domain, carried out in accordance with the laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia and the United States. The families who were removed received legal compensation. Many were resettled in government-built housing. The park has since become one of the most visited natural areas in the eastern United States, protecting millions of acres of forest and wildlife habitat. That is true. All of that is true, and yet the compensation was, by the documented evidence, systematically below market value. The lifetime use permits extended to the elderly were, by the demographic mathematics of the time, calculated to expire within a decade. The language used in federal memos to describe the residents was the language of management, not of rights, and the entire process, from the 1926 legislation to the 1938 final removal, was conducted with almost no meaningful input from the families who would bear its costs. None of these facts individually constitute a scandal. Each one, looked at in isolation, fits within the range of how governments have always operated, imperfectly, self-interestedly, with a complicated mixture of genuine public benefit and casual disregard for the people in the way. But look at them together. Look at the pattern across 11 parks, across 14 years, across 1,000 letters written by families who use the word wrong, and the word home, and the phrase, "you cannot put a price on." And ask yourself a simple question. If the government had consulted those families first, genuinely consulted them, given them a real vote, a real voice in what would happen to their land, would any of those parks exist in the form they exist today? That is not a rhetorical question. That is an archival one, because the answer is probably yes. Some version of most of them would still exist. Parks are good things. Conservation is a good thing. The forest above the Shenandoah Valley is genuinely worth protecting. But the version that would have been negotiated, rather than imposed, might have looked different, might have kept some families in place, might have incorporated the farms into the park rather than erasing them, might have drawn the boundary lines differently. We will never know what that version looked like, because it was not the version that was chosen. The version that was chosen removed 2,000 people, drew a fence across their grandparents' graves, and then printed new maps that did not show the town had ever been there. If you visit Shenandoah National Park today, and you should, it is genuinely beautiful. You can drive the skyline. Drive from Front Royal to Rockfish Gap, 105 miles of mountain ridge, road with views on both sides that are as close to spectacular as that word is capable of meaning. And if you pull off at one of the overlooks and look down into the hollow below, down into the green, silent, apparently empty forest, you are looking at where the town was. The National Park Service estimates that approximately 170 distinct archaeological sites exist within the park boundary related to the former human habitation of the area: foundations, cellar holes, orchards gone feral, apple trees still producing fruit in the deep woods, planted by hands that have been dead for 80 years. 170 sites, 2,000 people, 60 days to leave. The maps were reprinted. The name was removed. The official story became the story of a wilderness preserved. But the stone walls are still there. And if you know where to look, if you step off the trail about 30 feet into the forest near the Corbin Hollow trailhead and walk downhill for about a quarter of a mile, you will find the foundation of a house, a good-sized house by the standards of the time. Stone-laid corners still standing at 45 degrees. A flat place in the earth where a floor once was. Nobody put a marker there. There is no brown sign explaining what it was. It is just there, quiet, waiting for someone to notice. And the question it asks is the same question it has been asking since 1938. If this was a good thing that was done here, if it was simply, straightforwardly, unambiguously good, then why did so much effort go into making sure that almost nobody would ever find out it happened?